We are here on August 22nd, 2005 to interview Judge Virgil Pittman. The interview is being conducted as part of the Oral History Project of the United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Although Judge Pittman has spent a large majority of his judicial career as District Court Judge for the Southern District of Alabama, he has also served on the Middle District bench. The interview of Judge Pittman is being conducted in his federal courthouse chambers in Mobile by Frank James, a former law clerk for Judge Pittman and an attorney practicing law in Birmingham, Alabama.
Now, Judge, Virgil Pittman is not your full name, is it?
Thomas.
Thomas Virgil
That's
Pittman.
my military name.
Right.
I've always used my middle name.
Why don't we start out, Judge, by having you relate some of your early years, where you were born.
I was born in Enterprise, Alabama, where the famous Boll Weevil Monument is. I was born in 1916. My father was working for the merchant who was the spearhead of that thing. It did not have a boll weevil on the top of it in the beginning. They put the boll weevil up there in World War I. And I can remember when I was about 5 years old, he'd take an umbrella and go out there in the morning and turn it on, and they had a lady with a disc up there and had a basin, the water would fall. And then in the afternoon. And so be that as may, Enterprise was 4 blocks long. It was incorporated in 1906. My mother lived what is now within the environment, so we could walk to the farm place. My father met my mother. He didn't like farm work, and I don't blame him. And he, at that time, was digging wells, and her
Water wells?
water wells. So he dug the well, and they put a windmill there and a tank reservoir there by the windmill. That's how he met my mother. And he later went into business for himself. He was a merchant, and he had a nice name brand clothes and all during the 20s. And next door, my deceased wife's father had a hardware store and a funeral business. And so I've known her and played with her since she was 4 or 5 years old, neighbor. You know, so close you might say, just with neighborhood child. And we started school at 5 years of age, had only 11 grades. So when I was about the 3rd or 4th grade, they added the 12th grade. So they jumped the 3rd of the class. So we jumped a grade. So we were really on the school for 11 years, but we graduated in the 12th grade. I lived diagonal across the street from the city school. I remember when it was built, about 1919. That's where grammar school was, 1st, 6th grade. Both the high school and junior high school was down the street in 1 block. Bob James, the governor's father, was a single coach about 2 doors down from me. And I knew him well. The boys would gather there at his place. He had a lot of good stories. He was a twin. He was left-handed, his brother was right-handed. Looked exactly alike. They had a lot of fun. We told a lot of good stories about it. So I graduated from high school in 1932. When the stock market crashed and the Great Depression came on, we were right in the middle of it. My daddy we lost our house, he lost his business, and same thing happened. Well, they didn't lose the house, but my wife's father and his brothers lost their hardware and funeral business, so they're broke. I went to Gadsden, Alabama in 1940 when I finished school, because cotton was just down to about 5 cents a pound, I think, and peanuts were real low. And so Gadsden had a big payroll, about 5,000 Republic Steel, about 3,500 Goodyear, and some cotton mills there. And so I practiced what law I practiced at Gadsden, Alabama. I first went with the FBI in 1940. Then they sent me to South America, about 300 other agents to South America and the Caribbean before the World War II started. I went in September. The war started in November. And I was down there 2 years. It was a third world country. And I was interested in it with possible airfields near the Panama Canal. And so I was single. So I left the FBI and joined the Navy. I had to apply. I had flat feet, so in a way I was lucky. I didn't stand deck watches. I was supply corps officer. And I was put on a big troop ship, and we covered every place from, my home base was San Francisco. I went to Namibia, just north of Australia. We went up and stopped at Guadalcanal when the fighting was going on. We went to Palawan over the China Sea when the soldiers didn't know about it then. This terrible war camp, one of the worst. And then we went through the Mindanao Straits after the invasion, or preceding the invasion, and we gathered the fleet. The fleet was gathering for an invasion to Japan. As far as you could see, every kind of ship in the world, and it was horrific. But the threat at that time sort of passed, and we were on our ship going from, it was a large troop ship. We'd go San Francisco about every 2 months. The Navy had sent me to Harvard, to a law school, Navy school. So I was 6 months, and this lady that I grew up with, I'd given her a reading to get married after the war. And I called up and said, come on up here, we got 6 months. So she got a house right back of the Harvard campus, and she walked down and meet me at the bridge over to graduate school where we were housed. And so we were married there. And
That's your childhood sweetheart?
yeah. Well,
Floyd.
no, we really had not been childhood sweethearts. I had an interim of several months. I dated her off and on all my life, and we got to dating during the interim I was there. And so I gave her a ring. And but in a small town, you date everybody one time or another. There's in your class, rich and poor alike. We didn't have much class distinction. And no, she always had a boyfriend, but he'd be out of town or something. This time he'd gone off to college. He was a football player, nice boy, I liked him. And anyway, that didn't turn out well. And so that's so much for that. Then I went to there and I joined the Navy. I went to Gaston after 1946 after I was terminated. And there were 15 people running for governor. My partner who took me in because he was legislator and needed somebody to help him out with his business while he was gone.
Who was that partner, Judge?
It was Miller. He was a smart boy. He was a smart young man. He'd been elected outstanding young lawyer in Gaston, but he sort of had a quirky background in a way. And his father was a lawyer, and he was eccentric. He'd walk down the street and tip his hat to dogs, and everybody that he passed on the street. But Ed was a real smart lawyer. It's common law then. And so he wanted me to run for somebody. 15 running. So a man in Anniston was a millionaire, and he had run and run a good race, spent $1.2 million of his own dollars, and this was back during the hard years. I decided if I help somebody, I want somebody that left me with a good reputation. So Gordon Persons had been public service commissioner, and he took a liking to me, and so suddenly had a vacancy on the state court after I'd been there 5 years, and he appointed me. 2 counties. This was a highly unionized town, and Pell City, St. Clair County agricultural town. I was real afraid that a legislator was going to run against me. His son later was on the Supreme Court, Frank Embry Jim, but he didn't. And so I had 2 races that I was unopposed. The last time I had opposition.
This was for he appointed you to the circuit court.
The circuit court in Gaston, 6-year terms.
Mm-hmm.
He was a prosecutor, and it's a nerve-wracking thing when you don't have a law practice to go back to. A boy in college. The girl had already gone to college and married, and she was away from home. And but it was satisfying when it was all over because I got almost 80% of the vote. And I'm glad I had that experience, but I sure glad I haven't had to run anymore.
When was that election?
That was I came in '66. That was when Goldwater ran,
64?
64.
Okay.
Yeah, 2
So
years before.
when were you appointed to the Circuit Court of Etowah County, Judge?
In October of 1951.
1951. And when did you first run for office?
Well, I had to run the next fall, next spring, October in the following.
So that'd be 1952 was your first race, your first.
No, I was on the bench, it had been in 51. Well, a governor, well, and still, the government had already taken office. But then the Democratic Party was so predominant, I had no Republican opposition. And so the deadline passed in March, I believe, and so I knew I was home free, except for the last time.
Now, can we go back? Enterprise is in Pike County, is that?
No, Coffee,
Coffee County, right. Is that one of the counties with 2 courthouses?
yes. Elba and Enterprise.
Alvin Enterprise.
Elba always had the political power. They always hold out some boxes just like Geneva. They could outvote Enterprise. But Enterprise is now so much larger than Elba. Elba still got that same old courthouse. Been through 2 floods, and the flood of 27, and in recent years they've had another flood there.
I think I was there with you once, and both courthouses were pretty run down.
Yeah, well, they've got a new one down in Enterprise. It's a new courthouse when I went there, but they've got a new courthouse now across the street from it, much nicer.
Do you remember your grandparents, Judge?
Oh, yes. I knew both of my great-grandparents on my mother's side. Both of them were 100 years old. One of them lived between Troy and Dothan, a little town out in the country. Both of them had gone to the Civil War, small farmers, but she was bedridden, and she was probably had Alzheimer's or something of that nature. But I remember visiting them, and I saw the farm and everything. My paternal great-grandmother was a Logan, and she had several sons, and I don't know how many females she had, but in those days, the Social Security system, they'd visit their children. So I can remember her when she was 100 years old visiting my grandfather. And then she had another son there in Enterprise, and she'd visit him, and they'd go around that's the way they did. My grandparents, they skipped a generation, but my mother there were 10 children, and I was amazed that I was in college before I realized where they were raised in just a small tenement house. But they built a nice farmhouse, that's when my father met her. And I have a picture of them when our youngest son was just a baby. He was just about 4 years, and he's still living, 93 or 4. And he was sickly all of his life. Isn't that something? The girls all lived to be in their 90s, except one died from cancer. But my grandparents both were short-lived. They died in their 60s.
Did you tell us your parents' names?
Yes, my father's name was Walter Oscar Pittman, W. Pittman. And my mother's name was Annie Lee Pittman. And her father's name was Thomas. I was named after him.
And where were your parents born, you remember?
Yes, they were born in Coffee County. Daddy's family, very small farmers, owned a few acres of land, farmed it, and they were about 15 miles out of Enterprise. And my mother's parents lived there in town. We used to walk out the house every week and stay.
Did you have brothers and sisters, Judge?
I had one brother. Daddy had married one of his best friend's sister, and Daddy married her, and the first year they had a baby, and she died from a disease rather unusual for a farm family, pellagra. And she was a lack of vegetables and green food and all. But I remember when I worked in the drugstore after high school, we kept a pound of Yeastman yeast stacked on the counter there. And that was used by a lot of them to counteract the pellagra. Daddy had a brother about his age, And he'd come stay with us and leave after Daddy got married. And he was kind of attached to the brother there. And so when he was about 18, and I used to go to her family, I thought they was kinfolks. They treated us like kinfolks. Because a lot of women died early in those days in childbirth. And he was in LA, so he took this boy out to LA. And he stayed out there most of his life. He came back to Alabama just before he died.
Were there other influential relatives who influenced your life, your activities?
I expect my grandmother on Mama's side, of all the grandchildren she had, I seem to be a favorite. And in those days, you'd visit them when they were dying. And I remember lined up, and I must have been about 10 or 12 years old. And she said something that's always been a amount of encouragement to me. Says, Virgil, you're going to amount to something someday. And I've often thought about that. You don't know what a spur that was to me.
That was a good deal of encouragement for you. What were some of the things that you liked to do when you were growing up in Enterprise, Judge?
Well, I was crazy about sports, but I was not good. I was little, I was slow, not quick. Well, I went out for football when I was a junior, when Bob James was coach. And the varsity was wearing the uniforms the year before. So I was here, 14 years old, weighed probably 125 pounds, and I had a hand-me-down uniform. Bob James took one look at me and said, Virgil, we need an assistant manager. That was being a water boy.
That was the water boy.
The water boy, we had a bucket of water. When they take time out, had a sponge in it. They'd take it out there and they'd pass around, and when they come back, it's the dirtiest looking water you ever seen. Played on dirt fields, sand spurs, but I'd get to make the trip. See, they'd go out of town, they'd come in, and I'd go out of class. Oh, that made me feel great.
You remember any other notables from Enterprise when you were growing up?
Well, he was not famous, but he was a most unusual man. He was a country lawyer right across the street from us when I lived, and he had a sister-in-law who lived as a history. I loved history. And he had an eye shade and white socks on. And he didn't have a big practice. He was captain of the National Guard, and the National Guard boy just loved him. He was a Southeastern football player, all Southeastern, at the University of Alabama about 1916. He used to, when I was in geometry class, I'd be going to town where Daddy lived, about 3 blocks from town. He'd be going over, he'd put his arm around and turn around. And he'd ask me the theorems in geometry, and if I missed a beat, he'd correct me. He taught his boys Latin. He was brilliant. Hard to converse with, he sort of talked disjointed. But, and so he sent both of those to private schools when they reached about 10th grade. And he never had a car all those years. He eventually, when I was in college, had bought a car for the first time for his wife's use. I don't think he ever drove it. And, but he had a great influence on my life.
Do you remember his name, Judge?
Hicks, J.W. Hicks. He just had a son that died in an obituary, a page and a half long, all the honors he had. He was an ear, nose, and throat man. And he married into the Barber family, one of the girls in the Barber family. And so, and he made an unusually good salary for a starting person. Well, U.S. District Judge is making $10,000. That was his starting salary. And so they had a Black Angus farm down at Union Springs. And he gave the bull from those Anguses of South America, Alabama, all over the state. His daddy says he's going to give away everything he's got. Very generous. We had a little girl from Enterprise who was skiing behind a boat with a propeller. And the blades caught her, just tore up her face. He took her up there and redid her nose and her breathing and all. and put her in a home out there, for a guest house at his house, kept her 3 months, didn't charge her a dime. And if I went in there for anything, he'd have to check me over, and Floyd go, she had a little hump in her nose, said she was hit with a baseball when she was a child, and he wanted to straighten that out. She did. It was not unattractive at all. I think it added to her features. But he was the kindest person in the world. His brother was quiet, really smarter. Jim wasn't the greatest student in the world, but his brother was brilliant, and he sent him to England, and he spent maybe a year over there studying. Now, he was a great influence on a lot of other of the boys that belonged to the National Guard. He died from cancer, and those boys in the National Guard loved him something, and his wife told me, said, they want to tell him just break down and cry. That's how beloved he was. But you never know that he was as brilliant as he was.
I think you just mentioned your wife's name for the first time. You've talked about it before.
Floyd Lassiter.
Right.
Floyd Lassiter.
Okay.
Lasseter.
Were there other community activities you were involved in when you were growing up there in Enterprise?
No, I worked. I didn't have any spending money. I picked cotton for a penny a pound when I was about 12 years old, from daylight to dark. I was going to pick 200 pounds of cotton. I got 175. And for white and blacks picked together. And so they'd have to we'd drink out of the same water jug. And so I remember it was right on the highway. It had just been made. It was real dusty. In the middle of the afternoon, we called it a roaster then. The top was up, and this fella came chugging down the road, kicking up. My back was hurt, and I was rubbing it, and I stood up, and I asked the fella, said, "Who is that?" He says, "Oh, that's Bob Adams." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Oh, he's just a jack-leg lawyer." He says, "What you mean, jack-leg? He doesn't know very much." I tell you something, he knows more than me and you. He's right in the shade where I am. Anyway, that was an interesting event. But my last year and a half, we had, first thing in the morning, we'd have 30 minutes, and usually bring in a preacher to talk to us. Even as a child, I knew something was amiss, because we had some Jewish children, very few Jewish people in the church, in the town. And, but anyway, they would excuse me from that, and I'd get up at 5 o'clock, and I had a bicycle, and take orders, and we'd deliver a loaf of bread, whatever they called in, bacon. And then my last class in the afternoon was study hall, and they excused me from that. So I'd go back and I'd ride that bicycle. And so I think one of the proudest moments of my life is I went in every back door in the best houses in town in Milltown. We had a cotton mill now. We had a Spanish-American War veteran. And I hate to say it was the dirtiest house I've ever been, but he's a real good customer. He had that Spanish-American veteran, and he had one leg. And I guess he didn't have anybody at home to look for him. We'd deliver cooking oil in a gallon. We had a big drum, and I put it in that basket. And I'd sometimes fall down, and I would win that cooking oil. But that was my story in high school. I worked before and after school for the last year and a half.
I'm going to guess that if they excused you from the first period and the last period, you must have been a pretty good student and a solid citizen.
Well, I didn't have time to get in trouble, that's for sure. I didn't even have time to date. Too tired. Well, worked Saturday night. We did as much business in that little town on Saturday as we did all week long. Cotton and peanuts. The farmers would come to town. And we even had a parking lot for the wagons. And we'd take the stuff out there, put them in the wagon. They'd come in by a week, month supply at a time.
So this would have been right at the beginning of the 30s, am I correct?
Yes, I finished high school in 32.
Okay.
So this would be in 31 and 32. We still had street sweepers. Our Enterprise was incorporated and built this little town, bricks in the street, and of course cotton was brought in wagons.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had street sweepers there until cars got enough. Had General went into town, and General Miller, Baptist church on one end, Methodist church on the other end. And so we had street sweepers up to, I think I started college.
So these were horse-drawn wagons?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mules were really more than horses.
Right. And how often would you see automobiles back in those days?
Mama took not very much. Daddy bought a open Chevrolet in the 20s before everything went south, and but they had curtains on the side. And then later he bought a Ford when they changed over from the pedal shift to the gear shift, and it was an enclosed car. But of course, depression had lost everything. It was hard. It was terrible.
And when did your father lose his business? Do you remember what year that was?
See, I know we lost our house about 1929. He lost, I guess, the business about the same time.
And what did he do after that?
He would got a line of credit in Montgomery. Mama had a little inheritance from the farm, 10 children. The farm wasn't that big. It didn't take a lot. He just had a hole in the wall. And during World War II, he made enough money to build a nice little 2-room brick house right around the corner from the church, halfway to the hospital. And so he had a nice little brick house the last few years of his life.
So you would have started college right in the middle of the Depression?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Where did you go to college, Judge?
University of Alabama,
How long were you there?
6 years. In those days, you could go to law school after 2 years. I was jerking soda. I jerked soda for 2 years. And my lifelong friend was a boy named Eris Paul. And somebody had told me that he'd gotten a lot of boys, jobs at the university, and he did. I expect during his lifetime he got between 100 and 200 boys. He was working there. He had jerked soda also. He was about 8 years older than me. And he pulled up, in those days you'd toot the horn, you like now these sonic places, except we didn't have roller skates. We'd go out and hang it on it, and they'd order a Coca-Cola and chocolate cheese crackers for 15 cents. And just on that, he knew my brother, but I didn't know him. And I told him that I'd heard he got a lot of boys, and I was dying to go to college. He said, I see what I do. I said, a month later, the manager called me and offered me a job.
The manager of?
The downstairs manager, Jeff Coleman, who Coleman Coliseum was named after, was also the business manager. And Alabama's been to the Rose Bowl 2 or 3 times then already. Mm-hmm. And so he just popped in and out. He's a very handsome, dapper man, and had a bookstore upstairs in his office. And so I jerked soda for 2 years. I was working $55 to $60 a week and carrying a full load. And I was going to summer school.
What was U.S. Paul doing at the time you started school?
He was still there.
He was still
He
there?
was sleeping night watchman then.
Okay.
And so
Now, he later became a judge, am I correct?
he was prosecutor. I came back to Elba, Alabama, and then he later became a circuit judge, and he served on the Board of Trustees at the University of Alabama for years. He was out doing all 3 and Lucy thing, and he was not a Wallace supporter at all. He lived through all of that. He was there when Bryant was brought back, and he knew Bryant well because the football players would scrimmage out there at Dennis Stadium, which is Denny Bryant Stadium now. It looked like a high school football play, pretty nice high school football field. And they'd come and hang around the soup store. And the soup store was a long soda fountain. Right on one end, and another soda jerk on the other end, had big air out there full of tables. That was the student hangout between classes and what have you. And they would order by number. Like if somebody came in and wanted 2 Coca-Colas, 1 lemon and 1 cherry, the boys would order, squeeze one and put a cherry in the other one. No, give me a Virgin. And then they ordered sandwiches. Back of us, we had a little sort of sandwich grill. And they made sandwiches, they'd order sandwiches by number. 201, 101, 203. And So we, of course, naturally make mistakes occasionally. And those football players, after that scrimmage, they'd come in and hang around for mistakes to be made and eat it up. Bryant never did that. The university dressed up their football players for one. He was a handsome man.
You're speaking now, Paul Bryant.
Per Bryant.
He was a student while you were a student.
He played his last year of football there.
Uh-huh.
But he always was well dressed, and he married an honor student. She was mortarboard. She was cadet colonel, and name was Black from Montgomery, rather prominent black family in Montgomery. And I thought, oh, there's another pretty girl lost her head. I married a good-looking football player. You know the rest of the story.
What kind of a football player was he? Do you remember?
He was encouraged by what Zimmerman was a writer for the newspaper then. They traveled by train out there. And Thomas, the coach, of all places, little short, dumpy fellow, had been a quarterback at Notre Dame. And so he was talking to Zimmerman on the way to the West Coast, you know. So he called his football players. They brought Bryant back there, and he was sort of known as the other end. Don Hudson, fleet as a deer, was a pass catcher. He played for Green Bay Packers and had all kind of records in those years. And he told Zimmerman, says, this is probably our best football player.
Referring to
Bryant.
Bryant.
And that was his encouragement all the years. It stuck with him. He set out to prove Thomas was right. And I saw the game where his legendary broke his ankle, his leg. It was a small bone in a small college. And he was captain of the football team. We lost that ball game. Howard beat us, so that was the biggest. And we'd just been in the Rose Bowl the year before. But the year following that, they were national champions.
And you financed your way through school simply working at the superstore?
Yep.
What was tuition then in those days?
About $75.
A semester?
Big crowd lined up to Bob Adams, who was a lawyer here. His brother was executive vice president. And he would have been president of the university, except he had a bad drinking habit. But then he was getting old. But a long line of students would then, of course, work in the soup store. But your heart would be in your throat would to put the fees off. I owed almost $150 in fees, and they wouldn't give me my diploma when I finished. They wouldn't do that today. So I had to call my brother, and he had to go to the bank and borrow $150 so I could get my diploma.
Were you involved in politics?
Yes, yes, I was, school politics. Everybody, it was a very popular thing because it supposedly made the most money, and everybody lived for something to make money. So Ears had been president of that club, and I ran for it. I fortunately didn't have any opposition. And so had the worst snow. The field right back of the new field right back of Farrah Hall, Foster Auditorium, had just been built.
Farrah Hall being the law school building.
Yeah. And we had one of the worst snows and doing my dances they'd ever had there, so I did good to break even. I did get a trip to Chicago out of it, and I got a trip to New York out of it. Got to spend a night at Tommy Dorsey's home when he was a big band, a big player. Got a chance to play tennis with him, and that made good campus talk.
Any other people that you remember who later became famous?
Besides Bryant?
Besides Brian and Hudson, and I think you mentioned Frank Thomas, who was the coach.
Yeah. Prime Osmond was a lawyer, and he was a real good student. He came to Mobile to practice law. He ended up with a ball firm down in Florida. He became president of one of the railroads, and they merged. And yes, Prime was, of course, didn't everybody know that, but Prime was the example. Then Goering later became a circuit judge. He was a student there also.
You a circuit judge on the Fifth Circuit?
Yeah.
Okay. Walter P. Goering, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Any other famous athletes you remember from those days?
Charlie Boswell, the blind player. And Charlie, I knew, he was one of my favorites. I was crazy about Charlie. And he was a fine person.
Johnny McBrown went to the University
He
of
was,
Alabama.
yeah, he was from Dothan, Alabama, and we always played Dothan Enterprise. But I really didn't remember. Johnny was just a little bit ahead of me. Of course, I knew about him. And I remember listening to that football game. That's the first time I ever knew that Alabama was that kind of football team. Exciting. My cousin, we were at my cousin's house. Mama had a sister that lived there, and we were all there having lunch. Me and my cousin out in the barn trying to smoke a cigar and getting sick. But she was all excited. She was Alabama and all excited about it.
Do you remember any professors who might have, you think, maybe influenced you to some extent?
Pittman, crazy about Pittman. I liked Harwood, but Pittman was my favorite.
Now, that's Dean Hepburn at the law school?
He later became dean. He had a casebook that we used, and he later became dean of Emory.
Uh-huh. What did he teach you? You remember?
Torts.
Torts.
I didn't know what tort was. Never heard the word tort.
And you mentioned Professor Harwood. Do you remember his full name?
Oh yes, he taught me property, I believe. He was a good teacher. I liked him. He has a son on the Supreme Court now.
Yes, Bernard Harwood is that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, and Ed Livingston, Chief Justice, taught me common law pleading.
Was that before he became Chief Justice?
Oh yeah.
And he also has a son who's a lawyer, I believe, in Montgomery. Ed Livingston.
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay. Have we covered all your extracurricular activities at school? You mentioned you were working, your politics.
Oh well, I really didn't have time for anything else. You pick up a lot of things you could hang on a keychain, but really didn't pick up a lot.
What got you interested in the law, Judge?
My daddy was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln, and I learned to admire him early on. And you saw what a boy that had no influence or anything could do. Well, of course, he was the most unusual genius. But that was, I early on, if he'd be a lawyer, I'd like to be a lawyer. And I didn't want to work either. I didn't want to work in the cotton field. I didn't want to jerk soda all my life. And I didn't want to be somebody's clerk. And I wasn't in the clothing business at all. I wanted to get out of enterprise. Oh, by the way, Enterprise now has another district judge from this small town, went to the same church, and his daddy was a good friend of mine, Fuller. He's just been installed last year.
This is Judge Fuller up in the Middle District
Yeah,
of Alabama. So
yeah.
Enterprise has got two
But
U.S.
and that's
district
something,
judges.
from that small town, but went the same church that I went to, and so I've known the boy practically all his life, but I've never exposed to him very much. I did write him a recommendation.
Do you remember any of your law school classmates?
Yes, Jim Garrett, who later practiced law in Montgomery, I think his son was practicing there when I was there. Bob Stewart had died. He was the best respondent. Dean Harrison had just come there, and he was a terror of asking students questions. And he was Phi Beta Kappa, but he could stand on his feet and answer the questions most simply. I greatly admired him. My desk mate, you saw that seat out there, we had a desk mate. I always gravitated toward smart people, afraid somebody would rub off on me. But you learn their study habits, and you learn things that they could do. And he finished with the highest academic award the university had to give, the Sullivan Award at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the only lawyer in our class that got a job with a firm unless their family was in the business. And so he went with a firm in Memphis and stayed with them all his life. My daughter lived in Memphis one time. We went, and I went to see him. And he was great. Burt Banks, the Baton Death March, very good friend of mine.
And a long time, I guess, producer of Alabama football.
Oh
on
yes,
radio.
oh yes. He produced Bryant's teams.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I believe Burt once told me the story of when President Rose was there. He says if President Rose and Bear Bryant was in the same room, I hardly had room enough for both of them to go. Well, Bryant was very sociable. He used to come to Gadsden, he and Chuck Jordan, and give us a summer. And of course, I'd known him, so I was invited up, and he'd known me, just casual as a football player at the Six Star. And Ernest Williams, I was surprised at his diplomacy. Hank Crisp, who was line coach, recruited him, and he wanted to bring his own team. Before he would accept the job, he asked Hank Crisp to come out to Houston, San Antonio, I guess it was, or Houston, I forget which, and wanted to talk to him. And he didn't want to, he wanted him taken care of. So he got him to accept the intramural sport coaching and a professorship or something. But he got him secure in his job, and I really appreciate that tact. And Ernest Williams, a friend of mine who married into the paper mill company there, a smart boy, he worked in the treasurer's office, and I knew him quite well, a friend of mine. He was a negotiator, and so he's the one out there that negotiated with Bryant. And then when he first came back, the manager of the hotel that way, we had our quarterback club meeting. He would come there with Chuck Jordan. And he used to say all the time, all he wanted was a mule and 20 acres of land. So some of the club went up and on the mountain there and bought him 20 acres right at the top of the mountain and bought a jackass. And the quarterback club in that year was captain of the team, the quarterback club. And Bryant came there and they gave him that mule. Then he came there he had a manager over at Tala, which is right close to Gadsden. And he came, we were going to give him a car. He came that night. And of course, all the things were centered on the manager of the team and giving the team. But on the podium, Floyd and I was sitting there on the stand, and Bryant, and I knew I had to call on him to say a few words. And I said, the thing that I have admired, one of the greatest things about his discipline, he would take his best football players and bench them. And Joe Namath, he benched Joe Namath, kicked him off the team for the rest of the year. And they took a substitute quarterback, Steve Sloan, and he went to the Sugar Bowl. And I said the wrong team. I'd have to go look it up now. It was either Mississippi or Arkansas. But I said the wrong one. They went, no, no, no. So when Bryant got up to acknowledge my introduction, he turned to me and Floyd and said, Judge and Mrs. Livingston.
Now, Judge, I think you said you graduated from the University of Alabama Law School in 1938 and you went to work for the FBI in 1940?
1940.
What'd you do in between 38 to 40?
I wanted to practice law in Dothan. And I went down there and just couldn't find anybody that would hire you. I offered to work practically free. But I did find a man to say he was going to share his office space with me. But I had to bring my own furniture. Well, I didn't have any money to buy my furniture. That's the reason I went to the FBI. A girl that I'd had some dates with, after I ended up in the bookstore. I could type and do a little shorthand. And I worked in a bookstore. And I had to sleep in night watchman job. And I had a little time in the afternoon or at night to date. I hadn't, when I was behind a soda fountain, I couldn't date. I just didn't have dates. And it's pretty hard on an 18-year-old boy. In summer school, between schools, you could date some of these students, and a lot of them came from MSCW, which was a girls' school. A lot of school teachers came. They came from small towns. They'd been pretty restricted about dating too. So you got a few dates here, there, and yonder. Anyway, I had a few dates with her. She went to work for the FBI as a secretary, and she wrote me and says, "You ought to apply." And so when I didn't have the money, I said to myself, if I get accepted, I'm going to save $1,000 and quit, come back and buy me some furniture to practice the law. Well, you know what happened? That was in October. The next August, I was in Connecticut. I had taken some Spanish. And so they were looking, the story was that Roosevelt called Hoover in, and he was getting no information from the Army Intelligence, the Military Intelligence, or the State Department. And so he wanted Hoover to send somebody called SIS. I don't know what that was. Scuttlebutt. So since I'd taken some Spanish, I was out doing lend-lease, going into plants, trying to, you know, the government should have a book, things they do to prevent espionage and sabotage. And I was about 30 minutes from town, and I got a call to come to the office immediately. Had no idea what it was. So I turned on the siren, and we were right over a bank building at the end of the Commons at Yale, New Haven. And I just knew the bank was being robbed. Well, everything was peaceful. I raced upstairs. SAC, sent his secretary out of the room.
A special agent in charge?
Yeah, especially in charge. Won't know if I'd be interested in going to South America. I said, I make any more money? He says, we'll be on per diem. Well, that was about as much as I was making. I think I was making, what, $1,800 a year, or 22 or 300. Per diem was $7 a day. I said, yeah, I'm ready to go. So they sent me to refresher course. Well, the secretary, of course, knew what was going on. She whispered, told me the name of a boy that had just left, said, you might like to room with him. And he's a lifelong friend. He's almost identical. He was a first generation Italian, and his father had a drugstore on Long Island. He had called on the president of Boulevard Watch Company for some reason or other. And so he quit, and he spoke Spanish fluently, he spoke Italian. And so he joined what later became the CIA. Had no CIA then. I think Wild Bill Donovan was the man that was sort of behind it.
Was that
And
the
he was
OSS?
He was in a restroom in Paris at a urinal, and the president of Boulevard Watch Company was there and offered him a job. And he worked with him his entire life. He was our sales representative for South America, made a lot of money. And then he retired, and he has a nice home, he has a nice family, all of them smart as they can be. The girl he married was Polish. She was a hostess at the restaurant across the street where the FBI agents ate, and she later worked for the FBI, and I knew him during that courtship. And if I came to Washington when he was there, we'd go out to dinner together. We were great friends. And so I was going to New Jersey. And so I sent a telegram to his wife. I didn't know he was in the States. Could she meet me at the train? And then the train was right at the Capitol. And of all people, Joe met me. We had a nice little visit. So I visited with him. I stayed in the Navy. We had a little unit there in Gadsden, Alabama, right at Coosa River. And so anyway, I visited with him in a little home they had and 2 children. Then they went to Long Island, and they finally have a nice home there, and which I have a picture of. And so we still swapped Christmas cards, called each other at Christmas. And his health is really better than mine. Mine is pretty good, but my feet give me trouble about walking now. I can walk, but I can't walk long.
So you went to Gadsden after your Navy career?
Yeah,
That would have been about 1946.
yes, summer, July of 1946.
Okay. What was it like practicing law in Gadsden in 1946 to 51 or so?
Well, I opened the office by myself and didn't make enough money to hard to pay rent. And he was a legislator and he needed help. So he offered me a job. And he was smart as he could be.
That was Ed Miller.
Ed Miller, yeah.
Right.
My first client, though, before I went with him, were two Jewish boys whose mother was a widow. And they were going around selling, getting scrap iron and selling it. So they opened a hardware store. So I incorporated them. And I represented them all the time I was there. They named it Marvin. The other one was named Alan. Alan was a bookman. Marvin was a front man. Now Marvin's has got a chain of books of hardware stores in North Alabama and one or two maybe in Georgia and Mississippi. Alan is no longer associated with the firm. Alan served as a rabbi, and some kid when this famous submarine captain was running for senator, and he was very racist. And some 17-year-old boy drove by on a Saturday night when they were having services, and it hit the aorta in him. His blood pressure was gone, he was practically dead, and they saved his life. And he invited me to Gadsden recently and had some special friends and a dinner got together.
What other kinds of things did you do when you practiced law besides incorporation?
Oh, whatever came down the pike. We represented the bootlegger, and
A criminal case?
yeah, and he's a country club bootlegger, so they caught him dead-handed one time and couldn't convict him. He'd been the quarterback on the high school football team. He wrote it. Rowan Bone represented him. Rowan was appointed by Jim Folster to the Court of Appeals. Rowan ran for office and almost win. Likeable boy. And even in the Court of Appeals, he almost won, but he didn't. The bootlegger went to Oneonta, adjoining county, got an automobile business. And he was convicted of selling stolen cars. And Rowan came in my office one day dying laughing and said, I want you to read this letter. And he wrote him and said, Rowan, you and I have the hardest luck in the world. Says, you represented me there in Gadsden, and I was selling whiskey, and I got up and I came up here, and they got me for stolen cars and sent me to the penitentiary. Honest to God, I wasn't guilty of selling stolen cars. I was guilty as a Dickens selling whiskey. He said, you run for office and you can't win.
Now, if you never had to take
Now
a
we
bar,
haven't talked much about the Middle District.
well, we're about to get there, I think. You never had to take a bar exam, did you, Judge?
No. Thank goodness.
Was there a bar exam when you started practicing law?
Well, yes, they had a bar exam. The fellow I worked for in the bookstore was dying to be a lawyer. He took it a couple of times and never could pass it. But he was a genius when it came. He started a second-hand bookstore nationwide. That's what I did. In those days, you didn't have a Xerox machine. So when I went up to the bookstore, I typed up and you put it on a big disc. And so I know the title of every publisher book in the United States. I've typed them I don't know how many times. And I'd run off those things, and that's what I did. And I'd sell books too.
Now, how long were you a circuit judge in Gadsden?
15 years.
So
No
that'd be
over 15 years.
1951 to about 1966?
That's right.
So how does a circuit judge in Gadsden become a U.S. District Judge for the Middle and Southern District of Alabama?
Like all judges, politics, they're either involved in politics or they got a friend that's involved in politics.
So in your case,
Yes,
which one? Which was it in your case?
Mine,
Yes.
List Hill and John Sparkman.
They were your
We
friends?
were loyal Democrats, always stayed. Wallace was in his heyday then. I never was Wallace support. I knew Wallace. In fact, I never did tell him I got him a job with my friend who was running the student dining room. But he was carrying sandwiches around on a tray, and anybody particular from South Alabama, we'd recommend him for the job. He'd want to know if I knew of anybody that he needed somebody to work over. I said, yeah, how George was. I never told him. He never knew it, so far as I know.
Mhm. Judge, were you involved in politics when you were a circuit judge in Gadsden?
Yes, I stayed away from all state elections. However, I was a supporter of Hill and Sparkman. And the Democratic Party in Alabama was dominated by George Wallace, and so you had the Dixiecrats and you had the Loyalists. And so I was just small involved in supporting the candidates of the Democratic Committee in Gadsden, the Loyalist group, which was rather minor. List Hill was running for the Senate. Very attractive young man that I knew quite well, handsome young man named Martin in Gadsden.
That'd be Jim Martin?
Jim Martin. He ran for Senate. Ordinarily about 425 to 450,000 would vote in the primary when the probate judge and sheriff wasn't running. They're the ones, the sheriff particular, and the probate judge that would turn out the votes. Neither one of them were running. Mr. Hill got in deep trouble. He had for his campaign manager the man who was head of the League of Municipalities of the state, who was very close to Wallace. Wanted to keep Wallace out of the race as much as we could. He developed cancer, but it was sort of kept quiet. So they had to have somebody to help out. My Congressman Albert Raines was on a lot of the housing subcommittees. Mr. Hill had what the Hill-Burton Hospital plan. He put hospitals in every small county, put one in Coffee County, Hill-Burton Hospital. And the landscape was entirely different. That was his strongest call, the biggest thing he could run on. And he'd been a senator with a lot of power. My congressman being on the subcommittee that handled so much of the legislation in the House suggested me. I didn't want to get in it. Well, he told me that I ought to. And so he put up my name to be co-chairman. And I was co-chairman of the campaign. I operated out of an office in Birmingham. And I'd take off a day or two of the week and go to Birmingham and try to handle it from that direction.
This was co-chairman of which campaign?
Mr. Hill's campaign.
Okay.
He was in trouble in Montgomery, he was in trouble in Mobile because he was known as a liberal. We had a lot of union people, and I had made my peace with them, although one strike they had, I had to issue an injunction. But I did something I don't think any judge had ever done up there. If the union was on strike, the company lawyer would come in on Friday afternoon and want a temporary injunction. And I'd say, well, I've got to give the other side notice. So I said, I'll set it for Monday. Well, I'd call up the union lawyer and tell him that they'd file that and better get busy and I'm going to set a hearing on Monday morning. Well, they never had that to happen. Well, they used to have some terrible strikes up around Jasper, Alabama. I remember 1920, 21. Had to call out the troops. There were some killings up there. And so the son of the main union leader up there represented the union. He's a very reasonable fellow. So I'd set hearings, and I went along all right. A few rocks were thrown, but not until it got to the stage where someone was going to get hurt. And Maurice Bishop also represented the defendant. Maurice was a sole practitioner.
Out of Birmingham?
Out of Birmingham. And he was a brilliant lawyer. He couldn't keep the employees because he wouldn't pay them anything. But I did a lot of right-of-way condemnation proceedings in Gadsden. The interstates were being built. And he developed a relationship with me that was good. He'd get in those trucks and drive out with them. Well, because of the union representative was probably you could talk to, I'd give him a hearing and put it off, but then it got where I was really afraid. I don't know that any of the union members were involved in the Ku Klux Klan or not, but I had cross burned in my yard. So I came the person I had to issue an injunction. But something had happened, it never happened before. They'd been given a chance to have a hearing. And they respected me for it, and I treated them fairly. And I just didn't knee-jerk issue a temporary injunction. That's always been my policy. So when the fellow who ran for me tried to use that against me, they stayed with me. Jim Martin came within 6,000 votes of beating him.
Beating Lister Hill.
We got Lister Hill in Etowah County, where Jim Martin lived, a 2,000 vote majority of that 6. So here I sit today.
Because of that.
John Sparkman lived in Huntsville. The Pikeays carried me as a pledge until my senior year or my junior year. I never joined, didn't have the money, never paid the dues. But they allowed me to join the fraternity after I got in school politics. And I had a little time. And so I joined and he was a Pikeay. But he came to school dirt poor. I mean, not poor, poor. And he took great pride. Judge in Birmingham that handled the Arthur and Lucy case and had to issue an injunction was a Pikeay. Judge Lynn, who'd been, and Judge Lynn in many ways, Frank Johnson was respected by everybody, but Frank Johnson respected Judge Lynn, even though he was very conservative. And Judge Lynn was the third man on the school riding bus in Montgomery. But Frank and Judge Reeves had the majority.
What you mean the
Panel, 3-judge panel.
Right, that the Rosa Parks case?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
And so anyway, and also he did real well all through the Tennessee Valley. And he just won by 6,000 votes. We stood up past midnight and listened to the returns on things. That's one of the ways he's going to make it or not.
And so that's how you became a federal judge?
What's that?
Now, I noticed a photograph during our break here. Maybe you could, is this a photograph of your swearing-in ceremony?
Yes.
Can you identify these folks on this photograph?
On the left-hand side is me. That's Lister Hill, right back of me. And the next was my wife, who is now deceased, Floyd Lester Pittman. And that was John Sparkman. And that was a clerk. Now let me tell you the history of that. I had to resign from my job. We had no retirement. The judge had died there, best judge we had.
No retirement as a circuit judge?
Except Social Security.
Right.
His widow was starved to death. I had enough time with the FBI and the military. And in those days, you had to be 5 years ordinarily to get enough time in to even begin in the annuity system in the federal court system. The insurance we had was not Blue Cross, some other insurance company. You'd get this Blue Cross insurance. And so the first thing I had to do was to resign. I had to send a telegram to Governor Wallace resigning, which I did. And so I was in a hurry to get sworn in. Of course, I was sworn in a formal ceremony later. I wanted to use Hugo Black, but his name was still Black in Alabama.
You wanted him to swear you in?
I wanted to, but I couldn't because it'd be in the papers. That would hurt John Sparkman and Lister Hill, even though they were friends. There was a lady from Union Springs who was a tax judge. We couldn't find her. So I said, well, just get some clerk, somebody's got the authority to swear me in. So I was anxious to get sworn. First I got off the payroll. I needed to get on the payroll because I didn't have any resources. I came like a child coming to this world so far as finances was concerned. Had a mortgage on my house, bought one down here, had to put a second mortgage on it. So what money I've been able to save has been since I've been a senior judge. And we were very frugal. We didn't know anybody and I didn't make any friends with some of my rulings. By the way, did you ever look at those two leather-bound things about all my troubles back through the 75s.
I don't think I ever saw that.
Well, Madge did that for me. She was my secretary. You remember Madge?
Yeah, I do.
And I never looked through them either. But my present wife, she would like to read them. And she knows all the widows of all these people, the movers and makers in Mobile.
Uh-huh.
And so I've thrown them a bunch of Bush admirers. Well, I think all my help, maybe except you, and I don't know how you voted Republican. I don't think a single one of them ever voted. And of course, you know, I didn't try to influence anybody. And I didn't have many friends, even my own church.
Well, let me ask you, in 1966, when you were sworn in, did you have a formal swearing-in ceremony?
Oh, yes.
You remember who attended that?
Yes, I did. Frank Johnson came down here, and Truman Hobbs, who I think was president of the state bar. And Frank gave me about as good advice I ever had. He said, when you go up and down the stairs in that gown, just grab a hold of the middle of it and pull it up so you won't trip on it.
Were you sworn in Mobile?
Yeah, and Truman Hobbs says he didn't know which end of the horse they were going to get. And here's Paul, man I'm indebted to for having a college education, longtime trustee at the University of Alabama. And I wish I had a record of him. Everybody liked Eris. Eris, I'll bet you, got between 100 and 200 boys jobs, most of them from the southeast corner down there. There were 10 of us that worked at night, and half of them were boys that he had brought in now. And he did that throughout his lifetime after he became a trustee. And I went down, and he insisted, those days you could go to law school after 2 years. Well, I was afraid I might lose my job, and I wanted to get to law school. No, you're not going to lose your job. He's responsible for me getting an undergraduate degree. You could take an undergraduate degree for 3 years if you you get to law school. I'd be an undergraduate for 3 years. So I had to go to some summer schools to get the right subjects in. So I did not get my degree until 1939, my BS in commerce. But he's responsible for it. Responsible for getting my job. And even though he was a Democrat, Bob James appointed his son as sheriff. He just had that kind of personality. Mm-hmm. And so Lily and I had sat in front of me. I teased and said she married a fellow here, his name was Vanell. Her husband was sort of like he was probably made friends with everybody. We had a party down at the Fairhope Inn. And her family and all getting acquainted with the party. And Bob James was giving a party, he was out of office at that time next door, and he asked somebody who it was. And when it said Fennell, he came in and told Lily that her husband told him, he was just out of Auburn, told him all he knew about road building. And he was a fine man. He had a premonition. He set up a nice little trust fund, built a nice little brick house where she still lives. Beautiful backyard, 200 feet of the most beautiful oak trees you've ever seen. And set up a trust fund for those boys and for her. And then her mother lived with them, and her brother came and lived with her. So he died suddenly because he went to go see the doctor. He had a stroke, and he died, and suddenly she was a widow. And her mother lived till she was be 97, and she looked after her, but she was arthritic. Her mother had a mind, and wonderful person. I would have liked to have known her. And she had a brother who was in the military and had cancer of the throat, and he died from that, and he lived in this little town that had almost disappeared over the Delta, hard to get to the Veterans Hospital. So she brought him over here. And she said he was pretty self-sufficient. But she was a faithful church member. In fact, she said her mother tried to get her to drop some of it. I'm on her now to try to drop some. She just spends so much time doing it. But she's a genuine Christian. And so we decided to get together, and we walked in the mall. And I didn't really know her, just good morning, Miss Vanell. I didn't know how to pronounce her name, still can't spell it. And she has twin grandsons. And they were a delight. They were about 3 or 4 years old then, they're about 9 now. Fraternal, born a minute apart, don't look like, don't act like. One of them's real smart and the other one struggles a little bit. And cute as they can be. And when I asked her, what about going on a date, she told me she had talked to her son first. And I thought it was a put-off. I said, well, that's it. And that's the truth. She talks everything. I've been there. It had a problem come up. All 3 of her sons come in. And Chipper, who's at the bankruptcy court over here, the trustee, I didn't know him. Didn't know he was over there, in relation to her. And he comes by almost every day, and he can do anything. He's my handyman. And I don't climb up on stools anymore to change light bulbs, so he changes light bulbs. And I told him, I said, Chipper, get some of that weight off, or I don't want anything to happen to you. I said, that'd be a disaster. But single son down at Fairhope made quite a name for himself, been on national television with some of his homes, on some of the home and garden shows, not the main channels.
Right.
And he's single. The other one's married, and he's president of a concrete company, and he developed a striping business. Those twins came along, he had to have some money, and he's developed a good striping business. He does that at nighttime.
Mhm. Now, we should probably clarify for the record that you were first appointed to be a U.S. District Judge for the Southern District and the Middle District.
That's right.
Correct?
That was for, I served there for 4 to 5 years.
Who were your colleagues in the Southern District when you were first appointed?
Judge Thomas, only judge here.
And who were your colleagues in the Middle District when you were first appointed?
Frank Johnson.
Now, Judge Johnson practiced law in the Northern District of Alabama, and he was also appointed to the Middle District.
Yeah.
Isn't it kind of unusual for 2 judges in one district to come from outside the district?
When I got to be a senior judge, the 11th Circuit was always looking for another judge to help do the work, as my wife said. Well, I sort of enjoyed it because I got to see the other side of it. And they were always real nice to us. We were doing their work. And I enjoyed it. Frank told me one time he went Library of Congress. I guess he did it from his office. And we're the only 2 judges in the United States who wanted to serve in districts where we didn't live.
Well, isn't that amazing?
That's amazing. That made me different now. He was just curious. Another thing that Frank would like to do, he'd go back and take my state court record, and he went on the bench. Frank was a couple of years younger than me. And he used to tell them when he was presiding judge if the oldest sitting active presiding judge on the panel would be the presiding judge, not age-wise, but service-wise. And he used to enjoy telling me, kind of a long time I'd been a trial judge, he'd been one. Well, we got 2 judges here who've had over 100 and so many years trial experience.
Can you describe your relationship with Judge Johnson?
Excellent. Frank, his best friend came to see me and said, Frank needs a friend. And I personally liked Frank. Frank was smart as a whip. And I didn't know it. He first went to Birmingham Southern on a football scholarship. And they quit football, so he had to drop out. He went to Bassett Business School and learned shorthand and typing. And then later, he went back to school. He went to the University of Alabama. I didn't know Frank at the University of Alabama. I think it,
Was he there when you were there?
I don't think so. I don't remember him. I was there when George was there. In the newspaper had he and George was roommates, and I asked him, I said, no, that's not, we weren't roommates.
What did a federal judge make when you became a federal judge?
About the same thing I was making a state court judge. My salary was $12,500, and then we had a supplement. And it was around 17,500, 18. I don't know whether the district judge was making 20. It was pretty close to the same thing.
Uh-huh.
But we had no Social Security. And I had to run for office, which is a headache.
Right. And do you remember how your salary as a district judge compared to that, say, of a U.S. senator?
Of a what?
A U.S. senator?
Oh, I think they were maybe about the same. I'm not sure. I think the sons of Congressman Virgil different from our salaries a little bit.
Okay. But you could get a Coca-Cola for a nickel back in those days, could you?
Yeah. Except I sold Coca-Colas also at the ballroom dance was a big thing. And so another man from Southeast Alabama had the concession university for football games, baseball games, basketball games. But we had a national book, and he was out all over selling those books nationally. And he was, that's another thing through the years. I got 10% straight across the commission on, I sold peanuts and drinks. Of course, you couldn't sell bottled, you only sell bottled drinks. You had to pick them up. But the most money I ever made was one night we had a band from, it was an engineer's ball, had a Canadian name. And I sold drinks at $10. I didn't sell the peanuts. And I put on a tuxedo and hire somebody to help me. And after intermission, oh, I'd go out there and dance. Third, hand me down the tuxedo. Here said, got it from a friend of his, he'd worn it. A friend named 8-Ball. And then I got it. And you talk about a country boy going to town, dressed up in that tuxedo, anybody looked good. But I made $20 that night. And sold Coca-Colas for a dime.
That was a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. Much as I made at the superstore.
Besides you and Judge Johnson in the Middle District, who were some of the other court personnel that you remember when you first?
Well, Judge Reeves had offices there. And
Judge Reeves of the Court of Appeals
Yeah.
of the Fifth Circuit.
I had to use the place in the library, and I think I got he moved his law clerk out, and he had his office in the library, and I had that. But they built separate rooms with a separate elevator. And my office is right directly across the hall from Judge Reeves. And one little interesting, I got to know Judge Reeves quite well, and knew a lot about him. He'd been a great politician, he'd been a great trial lawyer. He was truly the most humble man, and he didn't have anything to be humble for. When he was recommended to the Court of Appeals, he went to Washington to talk to Hugo Black. So, you know, he didn't go to law school, he just studied somebody's lawyer. But he was a great lawyer. He had another incident I'll tell you about, but his only son was in the service, and he was killed in an accident in the States. And he buried him, and they had desecrated his son's gravesite. He belonged to a church where the man was the most segregated preacher you ever heard in all your life. He'd send them statewide. Somebody asked him, says, why don't you leave that church? That church doesn't belong to him, it belongs to the membership. And anyway, he had a Latin phrase on his wall. I think Frank James took me over there one day and wanted to show it to me. It was a Latin phrase. I took Latin, but I didn't remember that. And I couldn't translate it. So, you know what it means? Don't let the SOBs get you down. Well, Jenny, who is now his granddaughter.
That's Jenny Grenade, the Chief Judge
Grenade.
of this district.
Yeah. She, I think, was law clerk for Judge Godbold at that time. Judge Godbold was really a substitute child for Judge Reeves. They were in the same law firm. And she went to his office, and she looked up and saw that and said, grandfather. She could translate it. But Judge Reeves was a wonderful man. I liked him, he liked me. We one of the judicial conferences down in Disney World, out from Disney World now. He was by himself, and we just sort of knocked around together. I enjoyed him, and I think he enjoyed my company. I copied a hymn one time, and I've got to go back and find it again. When it talked about believing in something, being the only one when everybody was against you. And he was a very religious man, deeply religious, and I knew he was, and I deeply admired him. And of course, what Hugo Black told him was that, oh, go ahead, if you make mistakes, we'll correct you. But he had a statewide practice. He made a tape, I think for Jenny's benefit, which she gave to me to play. There was a man in the Tuscaloosa area there, out in the country, who was mean as he could be. And he shot a woman's husband in the back, filled it full of buckshot. She had 11 children. She couldn't get a lawyer to represent her. Everybody's scared of him. He got off on a plea of insanity. And so he went out and talked to a partner who was a doctor. And he's not crazy. He's a smart man. He's got a lot of property. He's done real well, but he's the business man in the world. Because why do you want to say, I won't represent him? So you better watch out, he'll kill you. Of course, Judge Reeves was a younger man then. I think he was probably 6 feet tall, trim. The woman came to him. The most he could recover was $25,000 and had it on a percentage basis. Now, he didn't tell me this. I just think he felt sorry for the woman. Couldn't get anybody to represent her. So he wrote the man a letter. And Sam Hobbs, very honorable man, excellent lawyer, had defended him. But nothing undercover anything. He did what any good lawyer do, to take his client. And he was successful in understanding to plea. And I knew him. He tried the case before me as a wonderful person. Outstanding lawyer. That was Truman's uncle. And told the man that, and the man had made some incriminating statements about what he would do. And so he had him cold turkey. And so he said he got himself a pistol, but he just left it hanging on the corner of his chair.
This is Judge Reeves?
This Judge Reeves.
Yeah.
And he was usually the first man in his office. When they got down there was a man sitting and his gun was gone. And so he told him, he said, who represents this? How you getting this case? He said, I wrote and told you that I represent this man. And he started ranting and raving, and he wanted to. Well, he wouldn't accept service. So the law was, and Judge Reeves was a smart lawyer. When he'd made the incriminating statements he'd made about evading service, he just threw it at his feet. And that constituted service. The man walked out in a huff. He wasn't about to pay any money. Well, the thing rocked on. I think it was a subsequent meeting. No, it was that meeting. I told him, he says, you got my gun, and you may kill me, but you better not come close to me, because if you do, I'll knock your teeth down your throat. He's a courageous man. Well, the man walked out in a huff, didn't do anything. So kept on. So next time he got the police to come in and offer him some help. And then he got the state police in there, carrying on negotiations. The man wasn't going, well, of course, he had a lien on his property. He had him cold turkey. So he finally paid the money. But the strange thing, he says after that, he called his bluff. Said he made a good citizen. All he didn't do that. That's amazing. Strange turnaround for a man. But he killed 2 or 3 people. He'd shoot them. He shot this woman's back. He had to pick the buckshot out of his back. Well, she had about 11 children. She was in destitute condition. So, see, he had he went on to Mississippi and tried some cases. He was a great trial lawyer and a great politician. He told me the story, and I won't go into that, about Bill Graves, who ran for governor. Been elected one time, elected another time. And he told me the story about Bill Graves. The newspapers wouldn't endorse him. Birmingham advertiser finally gave in. But Birmingham News wouldn't. He told him no, he promised his wife he wouldn't let him sell liquor. He wouldn't, while he was governor, unless it was, it wouldn't let him advertise the paper. That was it. Prohibition had been wiped out.
Right.
He's a wonderful man.
Were there magistrate judges in the Middle District when you
No,
were
we didn't have it. We just had a U.S. commissioner.
And what was the role of the U.S. Commissioner?
Well, anything that happened if somebody exceeded the duck limit or whatever it was.
On a federal reservation?
No, on any stream.
Oh, okay.
They had a limit on the number of certain birds you couldn't kill, certain fowl, waterfowl you couldn't kill. I tried a lawyer here, and he came with a very ingenious defense, but he still got the $25 fine. They caught him cold turkey with a bunch of fowl that weren't supposed to. He'd exceeded the duck limit, I think.
Who was your commissioner in the Middle District when you were appointed?
I don't remember who it was when I appointed, but I appointed one of the circuit judges here. I knew his father in school from Evergreen. And Judge Johnson appointed one in the Middle District that I was unaware of. It had the Army reservation, and it was still operating. And we tried them for breaking the speed limit or what have you.
Where did you hold court in the Middle District in those days, Judge?
There were two satellite courts, one in Opelika and one in Dothan. I told Judge Johnson that since I had to be out of town, I'd be willing to take all of them. That means you go to each place at least twice a year. You'd go there first to go through the docket, and you go back and you set your schedule of hearings and so forth. Then you go back for trial. And I think we did that twice a year at each place. And I enjoyed going to Dothan because I could travel to Enterprise about 35 miles and stay with my mother. And there's a place, restaurant, where all my schoolmates gathered, and one of them had been a football player at high school, and he was a principal of school. And they'd give me holy hell. I'd walk in, and there comes that justice of peace. And of course, you know, the old friends, I just say, well, boy, just keep paying your taxes. You can say what you please, just get it off your chest. And then we'd have a nice visit. And I knew several. I had known the superintendent of education. And they had written on the wall there, one thing you'll never hear in this room, I don't know. But a strange thing happened. There was a boy that was sort of a classroom dummy. I think he might have been passing. And he's the only one that spoke up and says, you know, Frank, Judge Johnson done what he should have done. And of course his name was tar everybody else. And he was deeply hurt that no lawyers in Montgomery, not the first one, came to his defense. He was real hurt.
What do you remember about some of the things that happened to Judge Johnson?
Judge Johnson had an adopted child. Some older woman near him had seduced that boy when he was just a teenager. And they had a lot of trouble with the boy. One thing that struck me, I was talking about having taught Sunday school for a number of years. And I used to teach Sunday school class. And as class grew, so at the First Baptist Church there, they had second class. But that boy who was just a kid says, Daddy, says, how can you stay in that church when we won't let black people in? So he left the church.
Judge Johnson left the church?
Left the church. And
did he go to another church?
no. He, Jay Wolf, who was a young preacher there at the Baptist church, visited him during his last illness. And he came back. I don't know whether he joined the church or not. He asked me to see if I could, but Judge Johnson, and then talk to him about things about religion. Judge Johnson was easy to work with. We got along good. I did try to be his friend. I made a point of it. But I admired him. He was all business. He had a secretary that is a formality even for me to get in to see him. But he was always very friendly and receptive. And I was his friend. And we would, his wife taught school, and she came in home from work one day, and that boy committed suicide with a shotgun, and she found him in that bloody mess. His heart was broken with that child.
Judge Johnson.
He hadn't been there too long before he said, would I keep the court running? He wanted to take the boy down to Florida to have some specialists look at him. And
boy had a lot of problems. Got him into law school, but your recollection and my recollection now is a little bit different.
Let's go with your recollection.
Yeah, well, my recollection, he didn't stay very long, but yours is a lot better than mine. I have a lot of things I don't remember reading. I can to tell a lot of these things, like he was telling Mama, there's nobody here to dispute you. I'm 89 years old.
Right. Anything else you recall about the
Well,
Judge
it was a
Johnson's?
pleasure to work with Judge Johnson. I know I did some things different from him. Never the first time did he suggest I do something different. He let me go my way, he went his way. I grew, and he wrote very positive opinions and rather short. Mine have always been rather long, and he really had a great mind. And he was a wonderful person to work with.
How was he affected by the way that he was treated in the press?
Well, he was more affected by no lawyer speaking up for him at all. Now, I had to run for office, and I knew what it was. And the little trouble I had here was down was nothing what he had. He would tell me about George Wallace. First he said they were not roommates. He ordered, when he was still state court judge, him to bring certain papers in. And he wouldn't do it. He told Brad he wanted to go to the room. So about midnight one night, somebody knocked on his door. And then we went down with George Wallace, and he had the papers there with him on the floor. And he said, George says, "Will you really put me in jail?" And he told him, "You bet your ass I would." So he left his papers. He wouldn't do it publicly. George said some very ugly things about him, and it hurt him deeply. And he felt the criticism because he was ostracized, and not just that, but statewide. Like my hometown, I had an aunt who, we were country people. My people only had 8 grades of school that went to. In fact, my mother's daddy was ignorant. He couldn't read or write, but his wife could, grandmother could. And he was about 10 or 15 years older than she was. And so I knew I was raised in, we didn't have a whole lot of blacks, only about 12.5% blacks in Enterprise. But they had that section of town. You didn't dare go down toward the courthouse. From the middle of town toward the courthouse was out Bailiwick on Saturday night. A lot of cuttings and drinking and so forth. And but there was one, I was born real close to one of the, we had 4 sessions quarters, and just then 300 or 400 yards it began. I was building the last house down there where we were renting. And only 3 houses off one of the main drags in Enterprise, not far from the courthouse. And so that's where Mom and Dad were renting rooms, home delivery. And but we went out of Coop, and we had what's called Baptist Hill, and they took 2 or 3 years to build a brick church over there. And but it was strictly a segregated society.
Well, speaking of segregation, let me ask you about the makeup of the court when you were in the Middle District from 66 to 71. Were there women and minorities employed by the court?
There were women, and had the only black clerk that I knew of in the state of Alabama.
The women were employed in the clerk's office?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And you say that there was a black clerk?
Had one black clerk.
Was that a woman also?
Woman.
And do you know when she began working for the court?
No, I don't.
Was it before you were
Oh,
appointed?
yes.
Okay. Do you remember any of the lawyers who practiced before you in the Middle District?
Oh, yes. There's quite a few of them. Of course, my college or their children Jim Garrett, I think it was his son, who was a classmate of mine. Ira Mint, who later was prosecutor, who later became a district judge. I think Ira's dead now. Truman Hobbs, great lawyer, great lawyer. And of course, he's a senior judge now. Bob Varner, practiced law for me, was later district judge. I think Bob's dead also now. And then from Robert Notman, who did some great legal work.
First Amendment lawyer?
Yeah. Several lawyers out of the firm that Judge Reeves have been in, John Gold have been in, Azar, Goldberg, Gill, Copeland, Bob Notman. Oh yeah, I have to tell you about Oakley Melton Jr. His daddy came and organized, his dad was a state circuit judge. I never organized a grand jury, so I invited him to come up and organize a grand jury. He was famous as a legislator. A bill came up, and I don't know why they had to have a bill, to use artificial insemination for livestock. And he made one of the funnest and humorous defense of why deny an animal its man's greatest pleasure. His son was practicing law, and I'll always remember Oakley.
Were there any women lawyers who practiced before you in those days? In 65 to 66 to 71?
Very few women lawyers. I graduated in 40, there were 4 in the whole law school. Very few women lawyers. Now I am a trustee of Sanford University, life trustee. Over half of them are females. And the same thing in the University of Alabama. You were assistant dean down there, weren't you?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So over half of the students at Sanford are
At the
women.
law school.
At the law school. Were there any minority lawyers who practiced before you in the Middle District?
Yeah. Fred Gay had already grown away from that. I think the first time I saw Fred was when Sonia was sworn in as a magistrate judge.
That's Sonia Bivens, who's the magistrate judge in the Southern District now.
And who you recommended to me when I employed him.
As your law clerk.
Is my law clerk, yeah. And I was very much impressed by Fred. Solomon Say, I liked Solomon Say. You couldn't help it. He was a former boxer and delightful personality. And I enjoyed having Solomon. Did you know Solomon?
I did. I think you told me a story about something that happened to his car.
You want me to tell that
Yes,
story?
please do.
Solomon had a Mercedes, I think, and he had the top turned down, and he had parked it down the black neighborhood. They had a lawn. I went down there and they had ripped up my seats and my tires. I said, next time I got to put a sign on there, this is a brother.
Well, let me ask you, Judge, how have things changed since you became a federal judge back in 1966? What are some of the notable changes?
Biggest change was women. Women were not on the juries. We began to have some blacks before that. I know that Oscar Adams, Judge Clemens, and
That's Judge U.W. Clement in the Northern District.
that's right. And let me see, I got his name now. Demetrius. Oh, what's the
Newton, is that
Yeah.
Demetrius Newton?
Yeah, they came down and defended 3 black men who had allegedly raped a girl on a date. We had what they called a mountain. It was really right foothills of Appalachian Mountains, a fun section of life. And they had little stopovers overseas. You could see Nakalula Falls, it was attractive at Gaston. And boys and girls would date there. And she was a nurse, a reputable man, dating where boys and girls park in a court, raped her. They only got 3 of them. The 4th one they never did identify. Of course, the first thing they did, they came down to court, and oftentimes they'd go into state court, and they'd call them Joe or Bill, and call them by the last name, and sort of treat them in inferior way, not the same way they treat the white lawyers. Of of course, I didn't feel that way about it. I called them mister. They made a motion to quash the grand jury. Well, Judge Reeves had ruled in a case down here in Mobile on a very similar condition. They had to quash the grand, which I did. Fortunately, I could talk. They had hired a special lawyer, and I could talk to him. I said, now, I could go ahead and try this case. Then you'd have to try it again and tell the family. I said that I'm going to quash it, but I would want you to explain why go through this ordeal more than one time. So he was able to control them, and I had a favorable newspaper reporter that had been kind to me, and he didn't get on me, and so I was able to weather that storm, which in a lot of places will happen.
Mhm.
So that was a great deal of help because I had to run for office.
Right.
You're
What
always
was-
conscious of that.
Right.
And we had a mailman who was walking from Baltimore to Miami, who was murdered in our county. And it was, thought maybe the Ku Klux Klan did it. We didn't have a lot of Klansmen in Gadsden, but there was some around. I told you I had that cross burned in my yard.
Mhm.
And so you can't favor one side or the other in the grand jury. But I did go back to the Magna Carta where they said that merchants traveling from one part of the English to another part of England were protected. And I told them that, and I said they ought to look into this thing very carefully. The law, people have a place to go from one place to another. It's historic, our law is grounded in all of that. Baltimore Sun was a very influential newspaper, and they had a reporter down there, and they wrote 2 or 3 real good editorials for me, which was a big help to me politically. And, but anyway, that is another story.
Right. Do you remember any of your cases as a district judge in the Middle District? Any of your important cases?
Well, of course, I've said every case is important. No, I don't remember of any particular case. And even in this district, the case that hurt me the most, I was reversed on it.
And which case was that?
A very small case. I don't even remember the name of it. But there was a veteran, and the law clearly says that United States veterans, I forget what conflict it was, ought to be given a nod of the head. In other words, little preference to them. He had a mortgage on a trailer home or something, and the man he was talking to, he wasn't told he was supposed to tell, so he don't have anything to worry about. And relying on him, he didn't take steps, and they foreclosed on him. And I ruled that that under those circumstances, even though he didn't talk, the man had authority to give to it. But I was reversed by the circuit court. That was one of the most important cases, and I think every case was important. I guess that the influence was, of course, the city of Gadsden case, where everybody gerrymanders. Democrats have always done it. It's an old custom. So with the gerrymandering law, we gerrymandered the districts in Mobile so the blacks will have enough clout they could elect somebody to office. And now the Republicans in power, they've had somebody come in and they've gerrymandered where they've got most of the Republicans. The most ridiculous one they had was in South Carolina where there's a little thin line. I think they overruled that one. Where it was so gerrymandered so badly that they just couldn't understand.
Mhm.
But those in Mobile had the most far-reaching effect.
Do you have any particular methods of preparing for trial, Judge?
Be prepared of the facts and the law.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is, listen, I had not practiced much law, but good lawyers are a blessing to everybody. My law partner used to say, if a lawyer comes in with one book, you better pay attention. If he comes with a stack of books, you don't have to pay much attention to him. And I couldn't understand it. I thought the weaker lawyer had the better. They'll get you in trouble. And change was going for the common law form of pleading, which works some terrible injustices. You had to hold your mouth just right to get around the plea and embankment, particularly corporate entities. It was horrible, but still almost in either pleading, and that's what we want. And I would bring it up, and we'd meet together once a year. I don't think there was 16 circuit judges in Alabama, 3 in Birmingham, and maybe 3 in Mobile, and now we got that many in Birmingham.
During the 2 years that I was your law clerk, you never tried a civil jury case to a conclusion. At some point during the trial, you would always get the lawyers together in your chambers and they would settle the case. I want to ask you.
I was fortunate because I did have some, not with you, but I did the same thing in state court. I'd always tried, we had so many. And we'd set 30 or 40 cases for trial and go through them in a hurry. But I always was able to get some settlements.
Judge Pittman, having been a judge for more than 50 years, I think you're probably uniquely qualified to talk about the competence of jurors, to understand and apply the law in simple and complex cases.
I think they get the sense of it. The only thing that I think they probably could not would be determine the present value of money, whether extended payments. I have talked to the lawyers ahead of time, and I've always been able to say, they're not going to understand this. I'll tell you what, let's do. You don't ask any questions on that. And when it's over with, it doesn't make a difference which side prevails before the date for the deliberations. We'll get an expert. Each one has to submit a name, and that you and I both know they're going to come up with substantially the same thing. So somebody you both agree on, and they will testify, and that will go in the record. Of course, we'll let them go ahead and deliberate and determine which way they're going to decide the case. And I've always been able to persuade them that's a sensible way to do it. I said, I even have difficulty, and if I have difficulty with it, then I think they certainly would. But the others, the details, I doubt it. Now, I don't believe in sending instructions back. Somebody does. But you get a bunch of lawyers in there when you do that. And you get various interpretations of this and that and the other. I prefer not to send my instructions in. And of course, they're pre-prepared. And I'd love to sort of add a little bit to it and try to make it clear. I take some chance in doing that because you've got to speak legalese to them. And they'll say, well, putting your own words, you're putting your own words and you get reversed. You have to be very careful about that. But I've always felt that I need a little explaining.
Well, this is another question for a veteran of more than 50 years on the bench. What do you see as the qualities of a good judge?
Patience, patience, patience. And be sure you give each side an opportunity when you rule against them to go off the record and put it. Of course, you have to have some sense of time. I'm only going to talk. You can't. The court reserves the right to limit you the amount of time you present it. But out of the hearing of the jury, put it in the record. We usually do it at sidebar, and they hear us mumbling, but they can't make sense of what's going on. And I said, keep your voice down and put it in the record. Francis Hare came from Monroeville over here, was a Birmingham lawyer. I believe was the finest lawyer that I ever had to appear for one. I said, we've got some mighty good here. Charlie Airdoll's one of them, and we've got some others. But that's all he ever asked. Said, Judge, can I make a record? And he'd be pricing to the point. I said, Mr. Hare, it's yours. And just put it in the record. And that's all he ever asked. And I tried a number of his cases, both as a circuit judge in Gadsden, Then when I was in Montgomery at Dothan, I tried some cases down here. He was just an excellent lawyer.
That would be Francis Harris Senior.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your judicial philosophy and how that has changed over the years, if at all?
Well, I laughed and told Frank, it hasn't changed a lot. To really know a judge's political philosophy, you've got to know his background. You'll have to realize that I came along during the Great Depression, and it was a depression. I lived in a cotton and peanut town. There was 2 blocks on each side. Bow Eagle Monument in the middle. On one end was a Baptist church, and the other end was a Methodist church. We had a Church of Christ that Dad would go to all churches. I didn't care what it was. It was interesting to me because they just had what we call the Jews' Hall to get the key. He even loved Sacred Heart singing. It meant nothing to me. I used to have to drive him to Sacred Heart singings on Sundays. And wherever church meeting was, Daddy would go to it. And so we went to all the churches. We didn't have any Catholic churches. I remember when Al Smith ran, all the Baptists, I thought Catholics were, the Pope was going to run the country. And they were Yankees, and they all had tails. And of course, it was right ironic that later a Catholic nurse retired lived next to him. And in Daddy's years, and she just looked after Daddy and Mama, who were up in years at that time, and he sort of had to change his mind. Of course, Judge Thomas here was married to a Catholic, and so I got introduced to most of the archbishops here, and they were all fine people. And I laughed and told Judge May that when he was doing the invitation one time, that I learned to find that Catholics were wonderful people. And of course, my present wife, her husband was Catholic, but she was Baptist. And she lived in a little town in Mississippi, just south of Memphis. That's where they went shopping. So she got married in Memphis, nearest Catholic church they had to her. And her husband was Catholic. And he was about 10 years old, about the same difference in our ages. But she stayed a Baptist all of her life and is still a very devoted Baptist. But then you have to realize that the biggest salary raise I ever got was on Roosevelt. They had NRA, which those 9 old men, as he called them, reversed him on. But little towns are real patriotic. I was working in the drugstore from about 5 o'clock in the morning to about 10 o'clock normally, and on Saturday night to midnight. And we'd stay open before Sunday school and about 2 to 4 in the afternoon, making $4 a week. And I was one of the few boys in town that got a job when they got out of high school. Roosevelt came along and we had the NRA program, 40 hours a week, minimum wage. The salary was double one over. I got $9 a week and 40 hours a week, and I didn't know what to do with my time. And then when I was in college, I was working about 55 to 60 hours a week behind the soda fountain at the University Supply Store in the Union Building, that old Union Building. And I was going to law school, and that was I didn't know why I could handle all that and be in law school. So my roommate, who had got me the job, had to sleep in night watchman job. And I got a job up in the bookstore, so I took typing and shorthand after work in Enterprise at a master's business school. I did janitorial work to pay for it over there. Learned a little shorthand and typing. So I had a job in the bookstore, but there was about 3 months lapse between the 2 jobs when they would be available, and I need something to tide me over. So it was a National Youth Administration program, and they paid me about $25 a month or something like that, and I went in the dean's office and did typing and shorthand work for that 3 months. So I come from a belief, and then Roosevelt also started Social Security. I have one of the oldest Social Security numbers you have. And so I was always afraid of an appendectomy taking me out, and had no way to pay for one away from home. And so I took out some Blue Cross insurance, and it was real cheap then. And So I lived through a depression and the Roosevelt programs. I believed in Greenspan, Strickland and Adam Smith. I took commerce. I had a little economics, and the cream rises to the top. Let them earn it and make it, and they go up the ladder. I got right amused at my brother when he first started a little funeral home in a nearby town. He didn't have any money to mount anything, and then the war came along, and he began to make money, and he joined a Rotary Club, and if he had a country club he belonged to, and I told him, that's the way it is. You start off starving to death, you're a Democrat, and then you get rich and you want to vote Republican. And he'd say, well, I'll vote for you Democrats one more time. And so Greenspan's frank about it. He says, no, he doesn't. He doesn't believe in social economics, which it is. You make the rich help the poor. And I said, I'll never complain about income taxes. I'll pay my share. And fortunately, with the little money that my wife and I accumulated since I've been a senior judge, I came like a newborn baby to the court. So when you come that way, you have a lot of empathy for people who are economically depressed. And so and we just had a small black community. We never had any trouble with the blacks. We had very Ku Klux Klanners. I remember going to a church down between Enterprise and Dothan. It was called the Flowing Well. I always hated to go down there at night time and remind me of Bob Crane. About that time I was studying about the Headless Horseman, and that's exactly what, we were down there one night, the church service stopped, Ku Klux Klan walked in one door, went down in front of the pulpit, preached a letter, and then they walked out the other. It was all over with. That's the first time I'd ever seen the Ku Klux Klan. We had some around Enterprise, but me and if I had a godfather lawyer, they charged the grandfather lived right across the street from us, and next door to him was Jonathan, the city school. And he probably picked up little girls and put them on his lap, but that was all it was. They never make me believe he did it. He had his own family. But somebody, the Ku Klux Klan took him out and beat him half to death one night. And he was terribly incensed about it, and I was too. So part of my background is having it the hard way and being benefited by programs that the Democrats always seem to be down for the little fellow, hard trot, so forth and so on. And so unless you know a man's completely background, a lot of people believe, well, I made it, why can't he make it? That's Greenspan's average. But I believe in minimum wages. And so that's, if you know a judge all of his history, you can see what I'm talking about.
Well, let me ask you about legislation and the role of the judge in dealing with legislation. Should a judge apply statutes or interpret statutes?
Well, you have to sometimes. Fortunately, in the federal system, you have a legislative history. You don't have a legislative history in the state statutes.
So we look at the legislative history, and it's an attempt to apply the law where it's ambiguous, and a lot of times statutes are ambiguous, and look at the intent and the purpose of all, and it's not a guessing game, but it really measures a judge's value, how well he can apply that. There's an old saying that a chancellor's justice is the size of every man's foot. So that's something you have to be always mindful of. You've got to have some formality. Now, there's some school of thought, there's particular German school of thought. We had a lawyer here that went to Harvard to that school of thought. You played by the rules, justice will come out. Well, yes and no. It gets to be a contest of lawyers instead of trying to apply equity in the case. And so I never was off that philosophy. There's a funny thing, he went to the same church I went to, and he was editor of the local bar paper, and he never named me by name, but just all federal judges ought to be impeached. And almost all of them anyway, new dealers, if you will. And it was right funny. Then we had another one that worked in the clerk's office, and Bob Adams. He was in the middle row, and I told Bob one time, we were good friends, I said, Bob, I've got a big tent down our church. Over here sits the lawyer that goes back to Achilles the Hun. You're in the middle, and I'm over here, I'm that flaming liberal communist.
What is your opinion of sentencing guidelines, Judge?
I'm sorry.
Sentencing guidelines. What do you have an opinion about
Sentencing guidelines?
Yes.
I don't think so. You can't go into a store and just take a suit off the rack. Of course, you need to custom tailor a man. In the sentencing guideline, you put the little, small, and there. Now, I haven't tried criminal cases. I got out of the criminal case because these cases that were 35 years old, and a fellow comes in and alleges anything, got nobody to contest what happened. We all know he didn't have a lawyer. If he did, it was generally incompetent. That was no problem. But there's no way to really find out the truth. And I dislike the retrospective, or at least it ought to be sort of a limitation on it. I had a man from California that had stabbed somebody to death 80 to 90 times, and he was up for parole. And he said, well, he was sentenced in this court. He didn't have a lawyer, and this and that and the other, and made all kind of allegations. Well, no way to confute. All the witnesses were dead, and the records were gone. And I said, these habeas corpses are driving me crazy. Now, I had some that were real good. I had one that I tried and sent back to state court, but it was basically in fairly recent years, and it had to do with prison problems.
Have you ever experienced, as a judge, have you ever experienced a conflict between the law and your conscience?
Well, there was a conflict, of course, in the segregation cases. Established law was that are separate but equal. But there comes a time that certain equitable principles, I think, must apply. That's just wrong. Yes, that was a conflict between my conscience and the law. However, I wasn't one that initiated it. It was, I think that Frank Johnson and Judge Reeves had a lot to do with it in Alabama, because they sat in the Rosa Parks case, 3-judge court. Judge Reeves was circuit judge, and Judge Lynn, one of the most respected judges in Alabama. Frank practically wanted to respect him. A wonderful judge, but he was a conservative bent. And he dissented, but he and Judge Reeves in the Rosa Parks case sat out. But not too often. Of course, my religion teaches that people not be divorced. But as state circuit judge, I tried divorce cases, and so there you are. But I don't know. So I think that you have to look at Caesar. Caesar said, given to Caesar that which is Caesar. I think the court should be secular in viewpoint, but your conscience basically gives you some idea of overall justice. And if you read Deuteronomy, there's some pretty good explanations of what a judge, neither the rich or the poor, don't favor one, don't favor the other. Real good instruction in Deuteronomy.
Have you ever reflected on your contributions to, as a judge, your overall contributions to the law, to society, to the courts, as a judge? Some of your most important contributions?
Well, I think that the gerrymandering districts is an old historical thing. And of course, when the Democrats were in power, we began to redraw the districts to give blacks sufficient voting power by gerrymandering the district to favor the blacks. And when the Republicans now have come into power, they've gerrymandered again, and so they've done the same thing. And in fact, the boy was raised next door to me. I didn't have no idea he was so smart. He was a doctor's son. And I lived next door to him for 2 or 3 years. And he was an Oxford graduate. And he did it. And he redistricted the Republicans benefited from it.
Who is that?
Stanley, one named Stanley.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't make my acquaintance. I didn't want him to feel influenced in any way, and I don't think he would have been.
Okay.
But I was proud of his achievement. His daddy was health officer for the county.
Let me ask you, Judge, who your judicial heroes are.
Judge Reeves is one. Judge Tuttle is outstanding as one. And both of them had different contributions. Judge Reeves came up the hard way. He studied law. He didn't go to law school. He took the bar. He was a brilliant lawyer. He was a brilliant politician. Judge Tuttle was an academic hero. He was Cornell. He was a polished writer. He contributed to the New York Times. He was the editor-in-chief of the Law Review. A brilliant academic record. And he made one of the finest talks to Emory. There's some misunderstanding. It just, on the record, it's not too clear. It was my recollection of it that he just made it to an Emory law class. And some others thought that he made it to a graduating Emory class. Be that as it may, he lived in Atlanta. I swear in all the lawyers, and I've taken parts of that about truly what a professional man is. And the basic line, he either has integrity or he doesn't. If he has it, he's invaluable. If he doesn't have it, he's worthless. And I think it's wonderful. Then Judge Cox, who took my place as a district judge, now retired appeals judge, he walked in my office one day and said, I want you to read this. It was Ann Quinlan. I never heard of her. So she's the third member of her family who has given the graduation talk at Villanova. I want you to read it. Well, I got interested in it. And so I found out that she was contributed to the New York Times. She'd written a few books. And I have a line from that what I give all the lawyers now. I give Judge Tuttle his history and achievements and his pro se work as a lawyer about it coming south, marrying his best friend's sister who was from the south, and the pro se work they did for the blacks before he became a judge, and his leading role in the civil rights and helping desegregate the South. And then she, since that time, had been a contributing essayist, Newsweek, on the back page generally of it. And but anyway, the line that I like that I put on there says, I want you to do well, but doing well is not good enough if you don't do good. And so I give that to all of my, I used to give them a Constitution, and the government quit buying them. So I quit giving that. So I give these now. So they are, Hugo Black is one of my heroes. He did one of the most dramatic things I've ever seen.
Still in Alabama, you didn't mention his name. He was our judge in the 11th Circuit, one of the first. And that's the way it was. They usually give it, if somebody on the Supreme Court, that party cuts it, he becomes our circuit judge, a Supreme Court judge. He was a small man, and he was fast approaching 80 when I came on the bench, 1966 in Atlanta, Georgia. And he slowly walked to the podium from out on the left side of where I was sitting near the center section. He had something wrapped up in the newspaper. And they slowly walked up to the podium and didn't say a word. And he opened up and began to read the 13th chapter of Corinthians about faith, love, hope, and charity. And the greatest of these is love, or something like that. Don't keep a record of wrong. Very dramatic. And that's about all they said. He was happy to be there and turned around and walked off the stage.
Oh.
And when he was buried, I understand he was buried in a wooden box, like the poor people are buried in the South. He came from a very poor county. I'll have to tell you a little story about him. I wanted to have him swear me in, but I couldn't do my son till I knew the pictures in Alabama, and they had to run for office, and it hurt them badly. But I'd never been in the Supreme Court building. So I told my wife, she's deceased now, let's go by the Supreme Court and look at it. And I got out and said, let's go up and see Judge Black. She said, he's not going to see you. I said, all he can do is say no. I've had no said to me a lot of times in my life. So I got up and I had my card, Chief Judge in 16th Judicial Circuit in Gadsden, Alabama, and told him I'd just been appointed and sworn in as a district judge. He saw me immediately. But he came from Clay County. My brother married a doctor's daughter who came from Clay County, same area where Justice Black came from. I said, did you ever stay with a gay family when you were running for Senate in Geneva, Alabama? He walked to the back of his office, had a little old-time safe back there, dialed, took out a little black book. Says, every time I went to Geneva, I spent the night with him. And so he talked to us for I don't know how long. And I got embarrassed. I thought it was taking too much of his time, so far in the back, I just politely excused myself. I thought I'd taken up as nice a time. But it was as nice as he could have been to me. And of course, a great memorial thing for me.
Who were some of the great lawyers that you knew in the Middle District?
Well, of course, the lawyer I mentioned to you from Monroe practicing there. I tried some of his cases down in Dothan. I had tried some of the circuit court in Gadsden. Both the two satellite courts, Opelika and Dothan. Have I told you that?
No, you haven't.
I told Frank, I have to be out of town anyway. If you want to, I'll be happy to take the entire docket. And of course, you'd have to go to set your pre-trial schedule up and get ready for trial, set a trial date, and then you come back to try it. And as I recall it, I know we did that once, but I think it was twice a year we did that. And then I do the same thing at Dothan. Well, Dothan was in driving distance from my hometown. And so I would go home, Mama by that time, Daddy was dead, and spend the night with her. And then I'd get up, and I'd go down to the local cafe where all my high school friends were gathered. And they'd always call me, there's a Justice Peace coming in. Well, one of the football players was then, I remember in high school when I was, he was principal of high school. And he was as sore as he could be about the edict he was under from Frank Johnson. And Royce would just sound off, and one or two others would. And I said, well, fellas, just go ahead and have you say, just pay your taxes, and I appreciate it very much. You help pay my salary. And of course, they laugh about it. But it's strange, and up on the wall, they had written, the fellow who ran the little cafe, said, one thing you'll never hear in this table, breakfast table, coffee table, is I don't know. We all have an answer for everything. But one of the class dummies that was in my class quietly spoke up. Says, you know, I think he was pumping gas. Frank Johnson was right. But of course, all that worked itself out.
Sure. Let me give you this wrap-up question. Is there anything?
Well, I want to say this about the lawyers. Truman Hobbs, who later became a district judge, was one of the great trial lawyers. He tried cases both in Montgomery and in Dothan. In fact, he reversed me in a case, a criminal case, over in Ozark, involved a bank and buying second-hand cars, and and so forth. I thought that he was abusing his office. And, but he was a great trial lawyer. And the members of his firm, most of all of them appeared before me one time in Dothan, a brilliant lawyer I knew in school, Royce Lewis, and Alto Lee. Alto may be dead by that time, but his son and members of his firm, a lot of them, Guy Hardwick, who'd been former Attorney General, no, Lieutenant Governor. Practiced there. I had known the guy from college days, great lawyer. I don't remember Guy coming down, but Royce did. I remember trying the case Royce was appointed in. And so Yetta Sanford and Bo Tarbert particularly, both later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Alabama. Yetta was a brilliant lawyer. He married a Mobile girl. I saw him recently. He was in Mobile. And he came with a young preacher who came to my church when he was unmarried. And my teenage daughter, all the girls were crazy about it. And he got her involved in church work. And she's about a 6 or 7-year-old woman right now. And she's still very much involved. And I credit him with that. And he's retired, just retired from the First Baptist Church in Athens, Georgia, after many years. And the little girl was a spinster. She went to the Highlands and opened up a little shop. And she was in her late 30s, I believe, and she married the nicest fellow who was probably 10 or 15 years older than she was. And I ran into him one day just as they were opening. I went by to see her. And they've had a wonderful marriage. So those was Ira DeMint, later became a district judge, was prosecuting attorney. Bob Varn, who later became a district judge, was a practicing attorney. Jim Garrett's son, I believe it was. Oakley Melton Jr. was there. I'll have to tell you about his daddy. His daddy came to Gadsden. His daddy was a state court circuit judge. I never organized a grand jury. I've been on the bench just a few weeks. So I called him and asked him if he'd come up and tell him. He was famous. He was in the legislature for making a very hilarious speech in the legislature. I don't know why they had to do it, but they're having a bill to pass, you could artificially inseminate cows and horses and mules. Well, mules, of course, product of a horse and a jackass. And he made this emotional speech. We weren't treating animals right. One of man's greatest pleasures is procreating and raising his children. Why shouldn't they have the same rights we had? Anyway, his son was a lawyer there. And so, Walter Byers, great lawyer.
Walter Byers,
Byers,
a former president of the bar, Alabama State Bar.
He could have been. I don't know. He was an old law firm. He was a personal friend of maybe a close, distant relative, Iris Paul, how I got to know him.
Yeah.
But he was a wonderful person. He was a practicing lawyer there. And so quite a few of them have become district judges. Great ones. Truman Hobbs particularly.
And I remember you telling me a story about a friend of yours who reversed you and then teased you about it.
Oh, Red Clark. Red Clark, I was pledged to Pike because of a man who had worked and later was chief right hand of John Spartman. And I didn't have any money to join, so the Pike just carried me without paying until my junior year in college, law school. And I scraped up enough to pay for my membership. I never did pay those past dues. And so John Spartman was a Pike KA. And I'm sorry I lost my train of thought when I started telling you. Asked me about.
I was asking you about a longtime friend of yours who reversed you in a case and then teased
Oh yeah,
you about it.
oh yeah. Red was a Pike KA.
That's Red Clark.
Yeah, Red Clark, and he was married to Sarah Dominic, who was real smart. She was a lawyer herself. Red came, and that red hair meant just that. He had a temper. Hard, he'd take the case away from him if you let him. And of course, I'd keep him in line. And he reversed me in a very unusual case about a railroad crossing. And a man had gotten a leg cut off at one of these wooden railroad crossings. And I held that it was, of course, you know, the house and others now, the steel girds have put that much smoother. That it was not repaired correctly. When the Supreme Court held me, no, the expert testimony on that wasn't good. Very conservative Supreme Court then. But he reversed me on preponderance of evidence. And Red liked to drink, and he went to all the conventions. And he left to get me in the crowd and put his arm around my old fraternity brothers here. Said he's a great lawyer. But you know, one time I reversed him. on preposterous elders. But he was crazy about me and my son. He hired my son, and he was with a defendant law firm for 5 years. But Red worked for me in Yancey. He used to come to my court quite a bit. And he worked for his lifetime before he made any money. And he felt the same way about, you know, the lawyers coming along after him. But he put him under Bill Badden's wing, one of the finest trial lawyers in the state. And he's the one that's responsible for what success he's had. Anyway, he saw where the money was in trial work, plaintiff work, and so he pulled out. And
That's your son that you're
Yeah.
referring to now.
so he later had his own firm, and they've done quite well. And until we have such I told him, I said, don't ever try to get too close to a judge. If you do, the right kind of judge would be so self-conscious about it, unconsciously, he may be just a little bit strict. In a close case, he might rule against you. Just got to show you impartial. It's a thing you have no control over. And I said, if you get one that's not the right kind of judge, he'll let you down when you need it the worst. And an example of that was the brilliant lawyer that made the Chief Justice. He did the dumbest thing ever, and was to solicit lawyers to pay for him for fees. And they beat him. And they've had a black name ever since. The whipping boy of a conservative about the trial lawyers. In fact, we have John Carroll, who was a magistrate judge in a great one in Montgomery, who's head of, his parents were educators. They have a John Carroll School in Birmingham. And he was going to name, want to make it the program they were noted for were trial lawyers. And I'm on the academic committee,
This is at Cumberland Law School.
Cumberland Law School at Sanford. Well, I'm a trustee. And I voted, you can't do that. It just won't fly. We won't accept it. And I had 2 doctors on it, and I knew they wouldn't accept it. You gotta do better than that. He worked it out. He came up with the perfect answer, trial advocacy. Well, defendant lawyers are trial lawyers just as much as the plaintiff lawyers have got this black name, black sheep of great big verdicts. Well, and they don't pay anything. They'll have, one reason they get a lot of cases, the country lawyers can't finance the investigation office. And so they get referral. Most of their business is referrals. And, they have a hard time now. They got a black name.
Well, let me wrap up with this question. Is there anything else, Judge, that you feel that someone interested in the history of the Middle District would like to know about you or others that you've come across?
Well, Frank Johnson became a very dear friend of mine. He had this son. Have we talked about that?
We have.
And Frank, at times, and we oftentimes, Ruth didn't go to the conventions, he'd withdraw himself. But Ruth and I became great friends.
That's Ruth Johnson, Judge
Yeah.
Johnson's wife.
I remember one of the last meetings we went to together when I was sitting with Asheville, North Carolina. There's an old hotel just outside of town now. And they renovated it, and it was during the some national holiday. And I think it was an army band came up and played, and they sat out on the patio there with the golf course out in the front. Frank was in the infantry. He went to Europe. Ruth was in the Navy. I was in the Navy. My son was in the Vietnam War in the Air Force. He was a pilot. And so if you or some member, close member of your family was in the service, you stand up when they're playing that thing. Well, Frank, Ruth between us and me, and Frank sat down after the infantry. Well, she was in Wave in the Navy, and I was in the Navy, so we stood there together. Very emotional, these songs being played, in a circle of everyone there. Most of them had experience with one or the other. And then, of course, she sat down, and then I stood up for the Air Force to call my son. Very emotional evening, and it was a beautiful night, a mild weather, not like this hot weather we have today. Yeah, I was impressed that he had a black law clerk. I would love to tell you about it. It's not in the Middle District, but it was down here.
Well, you can.
That when I became chief judge, when Judge Thomas took senior judge, of course our courtroom was, our clerk's office was small. There were 5 black people. I talked to the chief clerk. I said, we need to integrate this office. And he would interview them, and then he'd bring up the best prospects, and I'd either approve them or make a choice. And one of them was in the probation office. One of them in the clerk's office, the probation, were husband and wife. The wife in the clerk's office had gone to Howard, but she couldn't pass the bar examination. She got pregnant and quit, and he continued. He was a good probation officer, but he got involved with men of the opposite sex, and it shouldn't have been, and the involvement was of a sexual nature. And so I was not chief judge then, but if I'd been chief judge, I would have had to terminate him. One is just retired. Another one, who handles the financial matters of the court, is still there. So of the 5 that we put down there during my term as chief office, 4 of them for good cause stayed or left, like the wife that left. And another strange thing, her child was born on my birthday. I would like for that to be known, and I'm very proud of the fact that one of my magistrate judges is the first black judge that's been appointed recently, and you recommended her.
Recommended her to be your law clerk.
It's my law clerk,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And so she made a good one. And we have a committee composed of mostly, of course, almost always dominated by the defense lawyers. She'd been over here and tried a number of cases, and they were impressed with her fairness. Fred Gray came. And Fred didn't appear in my court. He'd already gone on to greater things. Made a wonderful spin. This black lawyer that she worked for in Atlanta, same firm she went with when she left me. And made wonderful recommendations for her. And she was, and she had continued to grow when she left me. She developed and developed. She just didn't stagnate. She grew. I'm real proud of her.
Well, Judge, I'm sure that the Middle District of Alabama appreciates you taking the time to submit to this interview, and I thank you. This has been a great experience for me also.
Well, it's a great pleasure. You'd be surprised how easy Frank was to work with. Easy to work with. I did some things differently. Let me cook my own pot, and he cooked his. And it was one of my value my friend. He was smart as a whip, and he could come right to the point. He wrote brilliantly. Okay.
Very good.
Oh, Rod Notman was one more I should have mentioned, and Rod Notman was a great lawyer and did some great work for him in the mental health case in Tuscaloosa. And Frank, I'm proud of you too. You've done a great job.
Well, thank you, Judge.
I don't know whether they know it or not, but I'll have to tell them when you left me, you went to the district attorney's office in Birmingham. Then you went down to the University of Alabama professor. You taught Sonia and recommended her to me. And you were what, assistant dean?
Yes.
And so I'm real proud of your record. And your wife had a state job, and you got tired of traveling back and forth, and so you went to Bruckowitz firm, which is now a more national firm. And so I'm proud of you. You're one of my
Thank you.
best. I want to say that you were in the Army, you were a captain, you had 2 tracks, 2 Vietnam trips, you were on the fast track, the Army was integrating. You had the courage that you wanted to be a lawyer. So you quit and went to law school. And that impressed me tremendously. You did real well, and you were a great law clerk.
Thank you.
You ought to be a district judge.
All right, guys.
don't let the SOBs get you down. Well, Jenny, who is now his granddaughter,
That's Jenny Grenade, the
Chief
chief
Judge
judge of
Grenade.
this district.
yeah, she, I think, was law clerk for Judge Godbolt at that time. Judge Godbolt was really a substitute child for Judge Reeves. They were in the same law firm. And she went in his office, and she looked up and saw that and said, "Grandfather." She could translate it. But Judge Reeves was a wonderful man.
Uh-huh.
I liked him, and he liked me. We, one of the judicial conferences down in Disney World, out from Disney World, when he was by himself, and we just sort of knocked around together. I enjoyed it, and I think he enjoyed my company. I copied a hymn one time, and I've got to go back and find it again, but it talked about believing in something, being the only one when everybody was against you. And he was a very religious man, deeply religious, and I knew he was, and I deeply admired him. And of course, what Hugo